you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense Report.
Hear ye, come one, come all. You are listening to the Sixth Sense Report with Joel Nikoloff and Darnell Samuels.
You ready for this, bro?
Man, I was born ready. I was already on fish and spaghetti.
I'll pass this on the spaghetti. Special
delivery. This episode is a special delivery to our listeners and to the Fraser Institute.
Yeah, special thanks to them, eh?
Super special thanks to the Fraser Institute for the invite to the Economics for Journalists program hosted by the Fraser Institute.
So how did you, this one half of a podcast, get invited? Or even, well, I guess two questions. One, what made you interested? And two, how did you get invited?
Okay, so I was interested in that. I follow the Fraser Institute on Twitter and all major outlets, and I read their articles and whatever they produce. They're basically, for those of you who don't know, they're a policy economic think tank. Believe in free market economics, so I follow those guys.
Are they based out of BC?
Okay. Yes, I think so.
I've always thought that, but I never really double checked it. But
yeah, I think so. And so basically, I saw they had a program, Economics for Journalists, and they also have one policy for journalists. But I applied for the journalist program, and they selected me. I was like one out of 25 people that were selected for the program. And basically the program is about, journalists learning to think economically and present the material to their audience in a way that's tangible and makes sense. So I had a ball, man. It was awesome. They had me up in the Marriott. That was a good look.
No big deal.
The food was good. First night we were at Joey's for dinner. So we had Joey's, a lot of networking going on. Even after the sessions, you got to hang out with the people, got to kick it, got to know a lot of people. So if you're shy, this is not for you. But yeah, man, it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it, man. It really blessed me, and and I'm excited for the listeners because they're gonna get a better product because of it.
So, two questions that come to my mind. One is, they put you up in a hotel. Was that the case pretty much for everybody that came to the conference? And then, my thought is to you, what, based on what you experienced, why do you think there was a willingness from them to pay for people to come to the conference as opposed to having people pay to come to the conference? I mean, they're paying you in kind.
Right. So basically, having journalists who can properly articulate or interpret the culture for their listeners or their readers is a very important aspect to the Fraser Institute. So it was worth them investing that time into those people who have a platform and a particular niche audience. And to help them think through these things, these economic principles. They thought it was important enough to, cover the bill.
So how long was the conference?
From the 30th to the 2nd.
So May 30th.
May 30th to the June 2nd.
Okay. So. So Thursday night, Is it Thursday?
Yeah, Thursday night.
Okay.
Yeah, Thursday night, and that was like game 1 of the NBA playoffs, so it was beautiful. So after kicking it with Joey's, everybody went to go watch the game,
The finals.
and then the next day, the first game of the finals, which was
And
rowdy
you were
environment,
downtown
loved it.
Toronto, right? So
Yeah, I was downtown Toronto, man. So it was a beautiful time to be downtown, man. I was just like, oh man, this is like, man, this is one step closer to heaven. It was great, man. Just the vibe was live, and meeting the people from the conference was good. Talking economics and politics and a whole bunch of other stuff. So it was beautiful.
So the second other question I have is in respect to the other people that were there. What was the spectrum of people in terms of whether it's ideology, where were they from, and then my thought too is like, how many people like in podcast world were from there?
Okay, well, in regards to the podcast, I was the only podcaster. In that, everybody was traditional journalists. They wrote articles and so forth. And it was funny because I kind of felt out of place in a way because I didn't see myself as a journalist. But the guys were kind of telling me that I am a journalist and that journalism is kind of moving away from the traditional medium, and people are now looking to independent outlets, podcasts, because people don't really read anymore. They rather listen. You can listen while you're washing dishes. You can listen while you're driving to work. So people listen to these outlets more. So I was like, wow, I'm a journalist. Like that's crazy. I never saw myself as that. So for that, I want to take the craft a little bit more seriously and study more. For the people who were there, we had people from like Omni Television, TV Ontario, the Toronto Sun, the National Post, Yahoo Finance Canada, from the Charles Adler Tonight, from Chorus Radio, some nationally syndicated radio shows, CBC News. So there was a lot of people from different outlets, but not everybody still had a different perspective on things. So there was still some pushback, and not everybody, held to the same economic principles. So it was good. It was really good.
Do you think there was an aspect where that's part of the reason why they wanted to kind of, let's say, pay for this conference, so that they would have people of different views, but also so that people with different views can actually read their articles with proper interpretation?
Sorry, what do you mean by that?
I guess my thought is, I think there's a scenario that's coming to mind. I once shared a video by Tim Moen, where he was basically critiquing Trudeau's policy. And one of my buddies commented something to the effect of like, I can't believe this guy thinks all these things. Like, he's so crazy. Like, essentially critique, saying he's like off the deep end. And I was like, Tim Moen, as he was breaking down the policies within the budget, and he was speaking to like the unintended consequences, or what are the economic principles that are at play, and how are things going to potentially play out. And so my buddy's listening to him go like, this guy's absurd, it's crazy, he can't actually believe these things. And my point is that when someone has a different ideological bent than you, and you propose, the way that I want to help the poor is X, Y, and Z, there's and it's such a contrast to the way that they would do it. There's almost this like switch in their head that says, oh no, you're just trying not to help the poor. And so what I'm thinking is like, when you've got someone who's far left at a conference like this, that's put on by relatively a free market institute, they're actually going to potentially be able to read an article that promotes helping the poor, just in an astronomically different way than they would originally. And so rather than demonize it, they're able to present it in a manner that's honest to the intentions of the article. And so that's where I was thinking, based on everything you've said, it seems like, well, that would be a reason why Fraser Institute would want to pay for it, because now you're going to bring people who have a different ideological bent than you, or a different policy perspective, but now they're actually going to be able to represent your side honestly, rather than misunderstanding, the more free market perspective.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. So it's important that we all are aligned with the right vocabulary.
Mm.
And I thought that was key, using the terms correctly so we're not misunderstanding each other. So once we're all, communicating with the right vocabulary, then ideas become a lot more clearer. So that's why it was good to have people from diverse outlets to be able to come together and say, okay, wait a minute, what do you mean by capitalism, free market, taxes, and so forth, so that we're all making sense of these terms and using them correctly and really thinking them through. And it's a process, we're all, and all the people there were learning, which made it for a pretty fun environment where it didn't feel like there was any prideful
Was it
people there.
Was it almost more like tutorial working sessions than let's say, a lecture?
Yeah. So it was definitely more tutorial, going over the basics. We played a lot of games. The teachers were excellent. They, because sometimes, economics can be dry and boring. But
a dismal science,
right? The dismal science, man, and it's just one of those things where you're just like, man, this is really boring. But the presenters were really good and encouraging. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. So one of the things I learned was one of the things we talked about was the economic way of thinking. So solving economic mysteries. I'm there's like a process.
I'm guessing you're jumping into one of your sessions that you had. So just
yeah,
as a super high level, I'm assuming we're not going to be able to cover everything that you touched. Why don't you give the listener a super high level of like the number of sessions, the spectrum of topics, and then let's say a couple of the sessions that you want to cover, or you think are worth covering.
Okay, yeah. Of course. So I'll give you you guys a brief overview. So for session 1, we talked about the economic way of thinking, solving economic mysteries. Then session 2, the mystery nations, institutions, growth, and freedom. And then session 3, making decisions at the margin. Then session 4, property rights and the tragedy of the commons. Session 5, be nice to the price, laws of supply and demand, and shortages and surpluses. Session 6, the numbers 1, what everyone should know about economics, nominal GDP and real GDP. Session 7, the numbers 2, what everyone should know about economics, CPI and unemployment rate and productivity. And then we looked at a case study analyzing a budget without breaking down by Ben Eisen. It's from the Fraser Institute. And then a case study, the end of the Chrétien consensus. That was by Ben Eisen as well. And then we had session 10, which was Trade Around the World, Canada and the Global Economy. And that was done by Mark Schrug. And then session 11, Money and Monetary Policy, Bill Watson. And then session 13, Why Good Politics is Bad Economics, Public Choice Theory, with Tony Hunt Ferrari and Bill Watson. And then session 14, Economics in the News, with Mark Schrug, Tony Hunt Ferrari, and Bill Watson. So just for the listeners, just so you guys can stay aligned with where we're going. So we're going to discuss session 1, the economic way of thinking, solving economic mysteries. And then we're going to look at session 4, property rights and the tragedy of the commons. And then session 13, why good politics is bad economics, public choice theory. I thought those three were the most helpful for me personally. Now, the first one, the economic way of thinking, solving economic mysteries, was just a very practical way of thinking through economics. So again, I'll define economics as the art of making choices, right? So point one, and if you're following at home and you want to take notes, so point one is people choose. Point two, people's choices involve costs. Point three, people respond to incentives in predictable ways. Point four, people create economic systems, rules of the game that influence individual choices and incentives. Point five, people gain when they trade voluntarily. Point six, people's choices have primary and secondary effects.
Okay, so let's jump through a couple. I mean, me and my history of I took a couple courses in university in economics. So right away, I'm like, I could, expound on all of those points in different ways. So I think people choose, it should be relatively straightforward. But the part I want to jump on is it makes me think of for Ludwig von Mises' book, Human Action. And I think he's referencing the same idea in that people act. And you could say people choosing and people acting are relatively the same thing. And those actions have involve costs.
Right.
So just to draw a parallel with the Austrian school, because I don't think they're necessarily an Austrian school. I would guess that Fraser Institute is a little bit more Chicago school, but I could be wrong.
Well, you know what?
I think they're
well. Maybe we should get Ben Eisen on the show to come on and explain what is the Fraser Institute and how they remain nonpartisan and where they fall on the economic spectrum and school of thought and why people need to be up on the work that Fraser Institute's doing. So
yeah. So
maybe we can reach out to him for that.
If he's listening to this, that's a formal invite. Let's get you on the show. But we'll see. We'll tweet the show at him. Maybe he'll follow up with us.
Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, of those points, is there anything for you, that you want to expound on, or you found really intriguing, or where you really learned the most, even?
Well, it was a lot of stuff that things that we've talked about. But again, I think it was just the profundity of the principles and how applicable they are to everyday life. So, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And looking at, just looking at the opportunity costs, even though something's free, it still costs you something. Well, what does it cost you? Well, your time.
Mm-hmm. Well,
right?
And that's where I thought people's choices involves cost is interesting if you really dig into, what do you mean by cost? Because I think opportunity cost is something that if people really comprehended what that meant, they would have a different perspective on many, many things. A really simple example, in the world that we currently live in, where people are talking about tax dollars going towards, in the U.S., they're talking about paying off education. In Ontario, we're talking about OSAP funding cuts. Opportunity costs would be where, the different places that, let's say, $100 million within the budget could go. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? So the opportunity cost is, if I give it to this place, it can't go to this place. So I'm using government, which probably sounds foreign for anyone who is normally listening to what I have to say. But if we look at it from an individual, your opportunity costs are, okay, I have $100 to spend on clothes. Well, I either spend $100 on a brand new pair of shoes, or maybe I can buy 4 different shirts, right? So the opportunity cost of a new pair of shoes is 4 shirts or $100 in savings.
Yeah, but we're always our choices are always being drawn towards something. And so that's why I found it very profound, just starting from the starting point of the art of making choices. So there's always a cost to every decision we make, and that to accept something is to reject something. And
something else.
Yeah, because, a lot of times when we think about economics, we always think about monetary. It always comes to money, and it kind of scares people. We think of charts and numbers, and yeah, it kind of scares people away. But there's also a simpler, more practical way to look at economics. The benefits exceed the cost. Just basic, simple things like that. And another phrase was mentioned was, if it matters, measure it. If it matters, we measure it. So, we always want to try our best to measure these things. So it brings into a lot of questions, even the way we do things as Canadians, like not measuring race statistics on, kids in school and so forth. So it just got you thinking. It just kind of got the wheels turning. But I found it very helpful.
I think a scenario that would, I think a way to, if anyone hasn't, my examples haven't worked so far, would be, when you have a family and you have an opportunity to work overtime, right? You don't have unlimited hours. So by working 10 hours in overtime in a week, you're rejecting 10 hours of time with your family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. So I don't know. I just thought of that on the spot, especially now that I've got 2 kids. Family time is very important. And so, you might get time and a half. You might get 2.5 times your pay for OT, but family time it might be invaluable in comparison. Right.
And one of I guess for me as a Christian, and I started thinking to myself, I'm like, okay, well, this economics, the art of making choices. I'm like, but as Christians, we work from a different paradigm. So like, making a choice to follow Jesus is an economic decision. It impacts your life and changes the way you look at money, the way you look at love, marriage, and so forth. So when you look at, in Luke chapter 14, verse 26 to 28, Jesus says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross, a tool of suffering, and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? So again, the art of making choices and being a Christian and having the call to follow Christ, and that is an economic decision. And even like there's like an aspect where you're thinking like, okay, well, there was a point prior to like me becoming a Christian, I had imperfect information based on the market I was in. I had imperfect information to make decisions as a Christian. So when you're converted and you become a Christian, then you have the correct enough information to make a decision on to follow him and what that's going to cost you going forward. So I was kind of making those connections. I was sitting there. I was like, oh, wow. Like, yeah, now I can kind of see the practical implications of economics in my theology. But yeah.
And I would say, you've laid out a text. One, if I think it's easy for people to misinterpret the first half to be like, so the Bible's telling me to hate everybody, which would be, eisegesis, right, is taken out of context, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but wouldn't you agree that that's saying in contrast to my calling towards God?
Yeah. So your love for God in comparison for others should look like hate. Yeah. And denial,
as opposed to act in a manner of hate towards.
Yeah. No, it's not like hate your mom, but you're choosing God over everything else. You choose God over your own life, and that is a decision that's going to cost you something.
And so what I was going to get at was that I think the interest, as you're breaking this down to me, that you're going through this in your mind, I think for the listener who either Christian or other people who aren't Christian, or the listener who's not a Christian, your worldview when it comes to morality and ethics also influences what costs are.
Yes,
and the
course.
Decisions you make are costs.
Right.
So as much as you're reflecting on your own, going, oh my goodness, I see the overlap of theology and economics, I would say that's going to reign true for everybody regardless of their worldview.
Nah.
In a different manner, in that, like, but my point is, if I'm going to align with this worldview or this worldview, and let's say,
yes, you're right, yes, okay,
whatever worldview you align with,
you're right.
It's going to reign true.
Right, you're right.
So, but I agree. There is a difference. There should be a difference when you're, holding to this idea of objective good.
Right.
So I think the other we've only really got into the first two, which is I think good because it's
one.
very we got into costs as a little bit too.
No, well, okay, so the next
costs.
Yeah, so the next one is Session 4, property rights.
I meant point 2, but
yeah.
Moving on to Session 4 because I like this one.
Session 4 deals with property rights and the tragedy of the commons.
For you, like, had you heard that term tragedy of the commons before?
Well, no. So I didn't know what that was, and it was basically, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically using a common space. So common space that nobody owns. So the air, the ocean, but also your work fridge.
So but what? So do you know what I think you've defined the second half, right? Like what qualifies as a commons, but what's the tragedy of the commons?
Well, the tragedy is the sin of people, using up the resource that other people have to use. So like if you have a pond and then you have fish in there, and then somebody uses up all the takes all the fish, and there's a fish for other people. Or, so you always usually have somebody or a couple individuals or just an individual using up the resource so that the other people won't be able to benefit from.
The idea is that the tragedy is that the individuals, because nobody owns it.
People misuse it.
Well, it's not that they misuse it. It's that people will
take advantage,
contribute. Well, it's that you as an individual are incentivized to use more than you contribute back, which means you're deteriorating that common good over time, right? So there's no incentive for somebody to contribute more to this common good than they use,
right? Okay,
because they reap no benefit from it, right? The benefit you reap is from taking, not from putting back. Now, over your lifetime, use a park as a simple example, right? The community that uses the park, individually, they will take more from the park than they put back. And this is why you have to pay taxation to the government for them to manage the park, because it's not owned by anyone in the first place.
Right. So the solution to the tragedy of the commons was property rights, and we talked a lot about property rights and why it's important. And I thought the most practical example they gave was the one with the kids and sharing and teaching kids to share. And I tweeted, or I posted on Instagram a survey, and it was pretty funny, but I got a lot of reaction from the survey. So this is the question, and you guys can follow along at home and tell us what you guys think. Very practical. So it's from Sesame Street's Parents Guide. So, Mom would bring home toys from garage sales, but not assign ownership to one of 3 children. Upon reflection, I could see how the fuzziness of ownership easily led to arguments. If everything belonged to everyone, then each child felt he had a right to use anything. So what's a private solution? Mom suggested 2 simple rules. First, never bring anything into the house without assigning clear ownership to one child. Second, the owner is not required to share. Now property rights, not parents, settle the arguments. What do you guys think? Or what do you think, Joel? I know what you think.
That's what. Yeah.
I know what you
because
think.
I replied. So you post. I don't remember the post specifically, but I know you put that basically the crux of what you just laid out there. You put that on Instagram.
Yeah.
The funny part is, me and my wife responded slightly differently.
Right. Well, slightly. But hold on. I gotta give them the math. I gotta give the math. Right.
Okay.
So the percentages.
I qualified my answer just to give the listener.
Oh yeah. So basically the way how the percentages broke down was, so 29% said yes, and then 71% said no. So the majority of everybody said no. It's not good to give kids, govern kids through property rights. It's better to just tell them to share.
So, what was the question that you, to be specific, what was the question you posed, the yes or no question?
Well, so is this a good solution to kids not sharing property rights, letting property rights govern how toys are being used, or you just have parents come in to police the situation? And everybody preferred, 71% said, okay, it's better to have parents come in and police the situation.
And so my answer was that I thought in and of itself it's not good, but I kind of liked it. But the reason I liked it is it like, to some extent what you said, dispute resolution is through property rights, but it doesn't teach the kids to share. So it doesn't do anything in and of itself with respect to sharing. It's creating a standard to stop the fighting. And so I would argue you kind of need you need to stop the fighting in order to then be able to teach them to share. Mm-hmm. Right? Like when they're fighting, and if you're in a constant state of fighting, you need to stop the fighting first. And so something like, these are your toys, these are your toys, these are your toys. You and now if someone is fighting over a toy, whose is it? Okay, problem solved. Right? In the sense of getting rid of the fighting. When it comes to sharing, I mean, my wife pointed this out to me, and it was like, she saw this, she was at a play place. We got a kid who's under 2 at the time. And she saw this at a play place and was like, okay, I was like, yep, that's what I'm doing, which was basically she saw a mom give a kid like a ball and said, go give this to somebody else. And I think the ball was from the play place. So it was a common property, but it was the idea of teaching the kid to share. I think the way that we currently teach kids to share is actually horrible and actually counterproductive. The way that we teach kids to share is when someone comes up to you and wants to steal your property, give it to them because you've had it for long enough. Now, obviously, I'm being a little bit ridiculous in the way I'm describing this scenario, but the reality is that is what we're doing. We wait until somebody else wants what we have, so we're not actually curtailing the envy problem, and then we're actually, and this is why I said it, I think it's horrible the way we teach them to share, because envy is the problem with the kid trying to steal that we're not addressing. And we're actually addressing it by telling the other kid, give him your stuff.
Right.
And so I just think it's, we're not actually teaching to share. We're teaching when someone's asking for your stuff, you should give it to them.
Yeah. No.
As opposed to like the scenario I laid out where it's like, okay, go give this to someone. Or, hey, your kid's been playing with something for 10 minutes. Hey, I think someone else wants to play with that. Can you go give it to them? And encouraging your kid to actually share, in essence, on their own volition, as opposed to under duress.
Yeah, and you want your kids to be able to share because they want to, and then that deserves a pat on the back versus, the parent coming in to police the situation and forcing the kid to share. Well, he didn't really share. Like, what is sharing really? Just right?
Did he do what he was told, or did he share?
Yeah, and at the end of the day, you know what I mean? The kid is still resentful. So I don't know.
So before we move on, I want to bring it back to this idea of like, people might think, oh, how is property rights actually solve the tragedy of the commons, right? So let's use a park example that I laid out. I have a buddy of mine who actually lives just off in Toronto, or Park Lawn is the exit that I go to his condo. And I remember being up in his condo, and there's like essentially 3 condo buildings that share this park, just based on proximity, and the park also has the water reservoir aspect that helps the buildings from being flooded / maintaining the, let's call it, the ecological system. And so the idea is if this park, which actually is fundamental from these buildings, not, from the land under those buildings being stable, as well as serving the citizens primarily that live in those buildings. Think of a condo, essentially all the people within each condo own a share in the condo building. Well, now if these condos collectively owned the park, between the 3 of them only, they would have, this is a anarchist anarchy capitalist solution to some extent. But the idea is that you would have perpetual contract agreements with each other, the three buildings. So if for some reason that condo was sold to a new company, this contract would be inherited. They wouldn't be able to void it. And that is essentially, let's say, property maintenance costs or whatever is a shared cost. Maybe they outsource the cost of this park, as well as getting an annual ecological assessment to determine if the water reservoir is doing its proper job. But all of this is a perpetual contract that if one of the buildings wanted to get out of, it would have to get the other two buildings, all three of these organizations would have to collectively agree how to move forward. Nobody can just unilaterally move out. And the reason why I want to bring that up is to show, well, this park now is not going to suffer from the tragedy of the commons. It's not going to be full of, trash, because the people that own the park are the ones who use the park. And so they have a vested interest in maintaining the park for their property value because they actually collectively own this park.
Okay. All right. So then the last point, or the last session that stuck out for me was session 13. Why Good Politics is Bad Economics, Public Choice Theory 101. And it reminded me of a very profound quote from economist Thomas Sowell in his book Basic Economics. And he says this: by its very nature, as a study of the use of scarce resources which have alternative uses, economics is about incremental trade-offs, not about needs or solutions. That may be why economists have never been as popular as politicians who promise to solve our problems and meet our needs. And so this is where we see the difference between politics and economics when it comes to public choice theory. And so defining public choice theory, we defined it as it applies to the analysis most often associated with the study of private markets to behavior in government. So basically, special interest groups lobbying to get politicians to get what they want done, and basically taking from the majority to give special privileges to a particular group. And so, yeah, that's what we talked about.
So, I mean, it sounds in essence that they were identifying the fact that public choice theory doesn't generally, or unfortunately doesn't actually support the individual as its primary purpose.
So it would be more like a special group. So for example, individual behavior in government is influenced by many of the same considerations that influence behavior in the markets. So what incentives motivate voters? What incentives motivate government officials? How do elected and appointed officials have or face scarcity? How do elected and appointed officials face competition? And how do elected officials make voluntary exchange for mutual gain?
So, yeah, in essence, the way that our political system is structured, the decisions or the incentives of the politician are not aligned with the needs of the
majority.
Yeah. Or even the everybody, even the minority, right? Like if politicians were making decisions that were effectively good for everybody, but maybe helped prevent injustice to a minority, people would look at that and go, you know what, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
We stopped hurting people among us. Maybe I'm a little bit naive to think that in general people would be happy about that.
Right.
But I think it's a fair assessment that most of the time, the majority will be happy when policy is passed that stops hurting the minorities.
Right. So even it kind of reminded me of the Maxime Bernier situation, where he was with the Conservative Party, but then he was like saying that they were because of public choice theory, they were compromising their convictions as conservatives, so they were no longer conservatives. So he broke off from them to start his own party. Because that was his accusation, was that these special interest groups have, I guess, infiltrated the Conservative Party, and so now the Conservative Party aren't using good economics to make decisions. They're basically playing politics to please whatever group can benefit them the most.
Yeah, I mean, in essence, what you're referring to, or what he was referring to, was this idea of like an agricultural board that, in essence, sets the price or prices of different, and specifically he was referring to the dairy board in this sense. And the idea behind it is, for the farmers, we want to make sure that they're better off, so that we're protecting the Canadian. This is the argument. If the dairy farmers of Canada are protected, well, then the citizens of Canada will get the dairy they need, or whatever however you want to play that out. But the idea is that from an economics perspective, if we allowed for, because part of the dairy board and agricultural board is that, and if you look at the North American Free Trade Agreement, or I don't remember what it's called now, the U.S. Canada Mexico Agreement or something, basically the Canadian dairy is a protected market. I don't know about you, where all our listeners are, but in Ontario, to get any dairy outside of Ontario is like literally almost impossible. I found a few things. There's Kerrygold's a brand from the UK. There's a company, La Centre, I think it's a French company from Quebec that but for the most part, everything's Ontario, and everything comes through an agricultural board that controls everything. And basically, Maxime Bernier wanted to blow them up, and open up Ontario or Canada from a agricultural perspective to free trade. So a simple example would be like, why should Vancouver have stuff shipped all the way from the other side of Canada when they might be able to get it, 5 hours away in the U.S.? And the idea there is that it's going to cost Vancouver less, or the citizens of Vancouver less, for their dairy, which would make them better off. I mean, without getting down into, but the idea is, from an economics perspective, this good politics, which panders to the Canadian individuals who are benefited, i.e. the dairy or the agricultural, those influenced by agriculture. So the good politics is, I'm going to help Canadians. I'm going to sell this to Canadians. But from an economics perspective, it actually makes us worse off in the long run, because maybe that the farms in Canada need to be repurposed for something else. Maybe cannabis. I'm just kidding. Well, maybe not. But the idea is that maybe there needs to be a reallocation of resources, because there's an alternative, i.e. the opportunity cost aspect of this, where for us, it would be better off to buy from a different place. So, and then this, there's going to be short-term pain in for that industry, where maybe the Canadian aspect of dairy has to contract by 50%. Well, those 50% people are going to be hurt in the short term. Yeah, but is that better than me being, living paycheck by paycheck because I can't quite afford all of my food? Right? Like, maybe if we drop the price of agriculture in Canada by 20%, that there's a larger number of people that don't really realize that, wait a second, I'm going to be better off on my day-to-day, where I'm not going to be as stressed from my paycheck, because my food cost, which is a fundamental aspect of living, is dropped by 20%. And so your point, good politics, because the optics are one way, but bad economics. And I think Frederick Bastiat, and I'll put this in the show notes page, you can get it as an ebook if you want to, or you can download it. The link I'll send will actually be, I don't know, I'll put up a couple links. I have the link right now for the actual, essentially it's an article by Frederick Bastiat called That Which Is Seen and That Which Is Not Seen. Frederick Bastiat was from like the 1800s, but it's amazing how this works. But the idea comes back to, what you were talking about with costs or opportunity costs. So what's seen is where you spent the money. What's not seen is the opportunity cost where you could have spent the money. And so economics is actually weighting those two things. It's comparing the seen thing, right, what actually happened, with what could have alternatively happened. And I think for so many, this is what makes it a dismal science, because you're measuring something that is almost immeasurable.
Right. One of the things that also stuck out was that in regards to incentives matter and how it impacted voters, public choice theory, I found it very fascinating. And we talked about this thing called rational ignorance. So voters, like consumers, favor candidates that provide them with the benefits they desire, support causes they wish to support. So because voters know that a single vote rarely makes a difference, they tend to free ride. So free ride means public good without paying for it. So for voters, they prefer to free ride on information provided by the media and the campaigns. So that means like low information voting. So they depend more on the media instead of researching it themselves, because taking time to do the research is costly just to do the work to look up what every platform believes. Like, who actually does that? Well, we do that because it's a Sixth Sense report, but but in general, people don't do that. So the cost is high and the benefits are low. So people rationally choose to be ignorant and rather play politics. So this is and it kind of hits to the heart of why we do this show, to inform people so they're actually not rationally ignorant but rationally informed.
So my wife was sharing with me, called me over, and she's doing some studying through Athabasca. I think it's in a psychology course. So she called me over to look at this thing called the need for cognition. So the idea is that people that are in a high need for cognition.
Sorry, what do you mean by cognition?
So the it's called the need for cognition. So cognition is like cognitive abilities, the ability to like think through things and get, it's kind of mental processing is the idea. Audience, there's kind of, they classify people as either being high need for cognition or low need for cognition. So people who are high rather than low in their need for cognition like to work on hard problems, search for clues, make fine distinctions, and analyze situations. And then the high NC is the way they referenced it. Audience should receive information-oriented appeals, and the low need for cognition audience should be treated to appeals that rely on the use of peripheral cues. But the idea is that me and you doing the dig deeping, it's like this aspect of like, I want to dig into an issue, right? We're demonstrating a high need for cognition, meaning I'm not going to listen to the debate on TV for the politicians and go, oh, you convinced me that you're better. I'm going to go look at the platform and go, this is hot garbage. This one's less hot garbage. This one's pretty decent. I can get behind this. And start to actually, how is this going to work? Right? So the idea of, stuff on the far left in the US where it's like, oh, we're going to cancel all student debt. We're going to, healthcare for Medicaid for all. The like high cognition individuals or high need for cognition individual would say, well, how are we going to pay for that? The low need for cognition individual would be focused on whether or not the person selling it is, believable. Do they think it's a good idea? Do they tell me they can do it? It's just a matter of funding. The government can print the money, right? Like it's presented in a way that I can get behind it. There's an emotional appeal to some extent. The peripheral cues is really in the presenter. That's what that's referring to. It's not the actual content of what the presenter is saying. And so I just, it's reflective of what you were saying with respect to, me and you in the way that we look at these issues. I got to dig in. I got to learn it. I got to figure out what's going on. I'm not going to record a podcast on something that I've, just heard a couple people speak on. I'm going to listen to like 5 podcasts on it. I'm going to, read a bunch of articles. That's why if you look at our show notes page, they're full of content. Because we didn't just go to one person. We didn't just go to one source. We didn't just go to the Fraser Institute. We went and found the National Post article that argues the complete opposite.
Right. So what's your 2 cents on this, on the 3 sessions, and economics for journalists in general?
Well, I think, you've kind of maybe you started off by saying something that I was like, yeah, I agree, which was, we're not really journalists, or you didn't look at yourself as a journalist. And I think that's, I would say I totally agreed with you. And my thought was like, I hate writing. So how could I be a journalist? And not that I hate writing. I'm just, I'm not in a place where I want to sit down and write. I mean, that was school for me, and I'm done with school to some extent. I prefer audio format. In both listening and speaking, I guess. And so to some extent, as we're talking, I'm kind of like, I was stewing over this idea of like, I guess we are journalists, because they were convincing you're journalists. And I'm like, well, if they're convincing you, I mean, me and you arguably do the same thing. I mean, you've got a blog, so wow, you got that one up on me with your journalism. But I think for the listener, it's that what makes us different from a journalistic perspective is that we're introducing the economics perspective and a theological perspective on these issues. And whether you agree with our economic perspective or our theological perspective, at least we're bringing that to the table. So much of the mainstream media reporting is not actually breaking down their theology, not actually breaking down their economics. It's deeply embedded in whatever they're telling you without telling you that that's what it is. Right? Like, you cracked open the Bible and was like, here's the text that was blowing my mind when I'm learning or when I'm listening to this stuff on economics, to go, to bring the theological side of it in, expound on it a bit, and then actually be able to say, okay, here's how I came to my conclusion. Here's why I'm thinking this way about a topic. And I would say what makes that better than the mainstream is that it allows the audience to go, okay, I can disagree with, some of your premises, or I can take issue with some of your premises, but I can see how you got there and I can respect it, as opposed to so much of mainstream is, here's what you should think on an issue. Without really telling you, okay, here's the economic principles behind it, or here's the theological perspective behind it. It's just, hey, the conservatives are evil, and I mean, oh man, I've been listening to some stuff lately. I try to listen to some stuff on the left, and it's just, it's. I mean, I wouldn't classify myself as right at all, but it's just so right. The right bashing. It's like, oh my goodness, you're just playing politics. You're not actually reporting. You're just playing politics. Mm-hmm. You're calling the conservatives racists, and it's like, are the people the 5 members of the KKK in Canada, are they conservatives? Maybe, sure, whatever. Like, are there people that are behaving poorly as a whole? Yeah. I it's crazy to hear that like anti-Semitism is increasing, right? Like, I don't know about you, but I definitely don't consider that to be people from the right. I mean, to me, that's I consider anti-Semitism to be nonpartisan for the most part. So I don't know. Sure, there's problems with people being jerks. There's problems with people being, hateful. Would I put that on the left or the right? No, I'd say it's pretty much equal on both sides. So, you know, I know I kind of stepped away from this. You know, what your question was what's my 2 cents? But my 2 cents is that, you know, until people stop, you know, throwing, you know, dirt at the other side and seeing what sticks and actually start engaging ideas, you know, I think we're still going to have a platform that people want to hear what we have to say. And hopefully they can start to, you know, I hope the audience reaches out to us when they see something and they're like, what's the economics behind this? If you don't know, you know, holla at us, you know, challenge us to break down the economics on stuff. I mean, I'd love to get, you know, an article from a listener being like, can you guys break this down on your show? Because we want to introduce the economics on it. We want to break down what the other, you know, side of it's, you know, like before I jump into this example of us steel manning, you know, I'll get your 2 cents on it, but I wanted to reference last week's episode on dodgeball with that idea of steel manning. You know, so Darnell, for you, you know, what's your 2 cents on this? On you know, going to this conference, you know, what would you say to the listener? How would you challenge the listener? How would you tell the listener they could go next year? What's your 2 cents?
Okay, well, I think that, well, I'm thankful for the time. So thank you again, Fraser Institute, for the opportunity. I'm extremely grateful. Learned a lot, and I'm going to definitely be trying my best to apply these principles to my reporting for the podcast. I met a lot of awesome people, and hopefully, you know, I would like to have some of the people I've met at the through the program on the show. Shout out to Graham Gordon. One day, hopefully, we'll get him on. He's an interesting character and has a unique perspective on things. Solid dude. So my 2 cents to the listener is, I was concerned about rational ignorance, and it really hit home for the show. And so, like, part of it is not letting the masses dictate what's right or what's true. So even as a Christian, you know, we know that the masses, the collective, don't determine what's right. But the scriptures and the individual is called to be responsible and make an informed decision. So when we look at, like, you know, some of the dilemmas or problems that come from the democratic process, the short-sightedness, spend now and worry about it later, the tension of the special interest groups, which leads to the rational ignorance effect. I just encourage the listener to be informed and do your research and make sound decisions. So for the listener, I would just encourage them to get back to the basics. What is right? What is true? What is the true? What is the good? Right? What is the Canadian?
Mm-hmm.
Looking at virtue and wisdom and making decisions. And that, yes, you know, your vote does matter. And that you do have credibility in the political process. And it still counts for something. So I would just encourage the listeners to be faithful citizens of your country. So those of us who are Canadians, and faithful citizens of the kingdom of God, and those two merge together in our economics and our theology. That's my 2 cents. And for those of you guys, for the audience, let us know what your 2 cents is on these issues. Maybe some of the sessions we mentioned we didn't cover that you would like us to cover in the future. Let us know.
So, the other side of it, you know, Six Cents Report's got an in with if you want to go to this conference next year, you should try and be an intern. You know,
that's funny.
Maybe we can hook you up.
That's funny.
And get you in that door, because, you know, we don't know about any other podcast that's been to this conference. So,
yeah. That's helpful.
I mean, and I would say, you know, you're right with respect to, you know, our vote does matter, and I would say the primary way that we actually vote is with our money.
Okay.
How you spend your money, where you spend your money, is your primary way of voting. So, that's a thought. Maybe if an audience member doesn't agree, or you think that's an interesting take, call back at me, and we can expound on that a little bit more.
Yeah. But in the meantime, follow us on Facebook at Six Cents Report, on Twitter at Six Cents Report. You can follow me, Darnell, Do Good at Darnell, on Twitter and on Instagram. So same thing. So DOGUDDA_Darnell, and that's Facebook and Twitter. And then Darnell Samuels on Facebook.
Yeah, on all social media, I'm TJoelN39. Whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Yeah. Follow me, tweet at me, message me. I'm down.
And remember, 6 cents makes change.
But you heard me? Does that make sense?